So first off, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming today to this NASCA sponsored event, COVID-19 and climate change in Indigenous communities. We're all very super excited to have you guys here and with us. Real quick, we do ask that you just keep your mics muted during this presentation. And if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box if you're afraid you're going to forget at the end, because at the end we will have a Q&A session. But yeah, also if you put them in the chat box, just kind of specify who you're directing it to, and then I'll read them off to our presenters at the end. Briefly, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Raina Butler, and I'm an intern with NASCA working on a food, land use, health, and climate action team. And the purpose of this team is to create better food cultures and communities, emphasize the interconnectedness between food, health, community, and sustainability, and to also plan projects about reducing climate change effects and to raise awareness. And then just a little bit about NASCA for those who are new here. NASCA is a local grassroots people-powered movement in Northern Arizona. We seek to bring people together to push for strong climate action in our communities, and we're working to build a grassroots movement to educate and empower people to take action to fight climate change. So yeah, if this interests you and you want to get further involved with NASCA, you can go, Jenna, who is the Coconino organizer, will drop the links in the chat to do so. So there will be the food, land use, and health climate action team to sign up for that if you want to get involved with that team, and then also upcoming NASCA events and volunteer opportunities. So yeah, moving on to the main event, why we're all here today. So it's abundantly clear that people experience disasters unevenly and differently. So the purpose of this event is about educating what's been done and what's continuing to be done to Indigenous communities and how those factors have amplified the effects of climate change and COVID. So today we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Karen Jarratt-Snider and Nikki Cooley as speakers talking about these very important topics. So Nikki Cooley will be talking about climate change in Indigenous communities. She is the co-manager for the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, Tribal Climate Change Program, otherwise known as ITEP. She is of the Dene Nation and a part of the ITEP team, whose goals is to strengthen tribal capacity and sovereignty in environmental and natural resource management through culturally relevant education, research, partnerships, and policy-based services. As the ITEP's climate change co-manager, she works with tribes across the continental US and Alaska on climate change adaptation, mitigation, and resilience planning. Prior to ITEP, Nikki worked with the Miriam Powell Center for Environmental Research at NAU on a climate change education program. In addition, as a river guide and cultural interpreter working on the Colorado River, Grand Canyon, and San Juan River, Nikki is the co-founder of the Native American River Guide Training Program, and Fifth World Discoveries was the first Native American president and vice president of the Grand Canyon River Guides Association. And then for the second half, Dr. Karen Jarratt-Snider, she will be talking about COVID in Indigenous communities specifically. She's of the Choctaw tribe in Mississippi and received her appointment in the Applied Indigenous Studies Department at NAU in 2008. And she specialized in Indigenous environmental justice, forestry policy and Indigenous people, tribal community participatory research models, federalism, Native American intergovernmental relations, tribal administration, federal Native American policy and law, and Indigenous people's rights and international law and policy. She also is the co-chair for the Commission of Native Americans, and throughout her career has had numerous papers and works published in multiple books and journals. All right, so I know that was a lot, so I am going to stop talking now, and I think we can go ahead and get started. So I'm going to pass this on to Nikki, who's going to talk to us about climate change.
All right. Thank you so much. That was quite an introduction that I'm a little embarrassed by. And just because, you know, I'd rather other people be the center of attention and whatnot, but I really appreciate it. I hope I do it justice. There's a lot to talk about when you're talking about climate change impacts and tribal Indigenous communities. So I'm gonna give you a little piece of it. Remember, there's more than 574 Indigenous communities in just the United States alone, but more worldwide. And we can only touch on, I think, what are some of the highlights of what how people are being impacted, but also what they're doing. So before I move on, I want to give a shout out to several some power women, I like to call them, Biji Ba Bigay. I think I have that right. I hope I didn't say your name wrong. And then Pat Ellsworth, and then my sister, Carmelita Chief, and many others. And also Karen, Dr. Jarratt-Snider is one of my mentors. She doesn't really think so, but I think so. There's a lot of amazing women and also men that got me here. So I really appreciate that. And also a shout out to Patrick. You got me here, involved with the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance and whatnot. So I'm really happy to be here. But also the other women and men that are on the Zoom call. Thank you for being here at 6 o'clock in the evening. It's amazing. I told my son, I got you spaghetti. Now don't come in for about 15 minutes. So he's going to come in about 10. So he'll make his debut. But before I move on, while I'm introducing myself, I wanted to see if you guys could share in the chat box, how you or your community is experiencing the changes in the climate. It could be minute, very small. It could be big. It could be something that you didn't notice last week, but you noticed this week. So I'd really love for you to participate in that way, and I'll read some of it off in a little bit. And when please ask me questions, anything. I'm very open person. I would love to hear what you have to say or what questions you may have or comments. Share, please. We're all here to learn from each other. So before I really start on the presentation, I wanted to show you and tell you where I come from. So for us, Dene, and even all the other indigenous tribes, we have clans. And I always introduce myself this way because it's the respectful thing to do to my relatives that are non-human, but also, my grandmother said, people are always listening to holy people, and all the plants and the animal relatives are listening to us. And so our identity is very much ingrained in where we live. So she kinyaani nishle look at the bashichin is it lana a dashinale to he dlini a dashiche Bestod isneshkis do shant hoda inasha a quit out a dene a stunnishle. I introduce myself to you in the Navajo way as a Navajo woman. So I am Kinyaani, which is I am of the Towering House clan. I come from these two matriarchs and many more before them that you see before you. But on the left side is my beautiful mother. So she raised 7 children. I don't know how she did it. I have 2 and I can barely keep it together sometimes. And then her mother, my grandmother, who has passed on, who has walked on, is on the right side. So she is my maternal grandmother, and so she's also Kinyaani. And then there's my daughter. She's 10 years old right now, so that was 10 years ago that this was taken. And so she's Kinyaani, little Kinyaani woman. And then I'm born for my father's clan, which is the Reed people clan. Paternal grandparents are of the Many Goats clan, and then maternal are of the Water That Flows Together clan. And I'm not getting emotional. Well, maybe I am. So, but I'm so sorry about that. These 2 women really had a big impact on my life. And so I just want to make sure I recognize them. And a lot of you have these matriarchs and patriarchs that are really amazing, but I always like to honor them because they really did teach me that the indigenous, our native identity is really embedded in the earth. And I'll talk more about how tribes are putting that into their work. We are not separated from the earth, the sky, the animals, and the plants, and so on. The list just goes on. And you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with climate change and indigenous communities? This is exactly what this is about. This is why we're striving to really be in the forefront of leading the nation in addressing climate change in unconventional ways, or more Western ways. We're using all of it. It's our time has come really to show showcase what tribes have been doing and are still doing. So, and it's no wonder I became a river guide, because, you know, my maternal grandparents are of the Water That Flows Together clan. I thought that was just beautiful. And I always thought that when I was at the confluence of the Little Colorado and the Big Colorado River when I was a river guide. So I could talk all day about climate change impacts, but I want to give you a few you know, pictures of what's going on there, and you can share in your community in the chat box about what's going on in your community. We have a lot of our relatives that are experiencing these storm surges, these severe storms that are impacting their coastlines. We have I'll talk about a tribe that's looking to address that, but you hear about our Alaska tribes, our Alaska villages, like the Newtok tribe, that their land base is shrinking because the water levels are rising, and there's some that are refusing to leave because that is literally where they are born and they want to be buried there. And it's also the same for the Louisiana band of Chittimata Indians. I believe I have that correct, in southeast Louisiana. So they are also experiencing storm surges, rising sea levels, and you just click on a Google link, and they're all over the news. They're kind of one of the most featured tribes that is experiencing just drastic events that are going on. Also, the picture in the middle is the Mission, I think it's the Mission Mountains, and I have that name. I'm not clear on that name correctly right now, but it's in Montana on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai lands, or the Flathead Reservation, and it has been burning severely almost every summer. And all these consistent fires that are often set by accidentally by humans or lightning, because it's so dry there, water tables are going down, precipitation events aren't happening as frequently, right? And and then in turn, that's impacting the air quality. My gosh, I went up there about probably 4 years ago, and I could not breathe. It was extremely hard for me. I sounded like a smoker when I laughed, and that was not good. I mean, just being there in that smoke was terrible. But also on the right side, you see this salmon, and that kind of represents the food, right? The foods that are being impacted. Us tribes, we very much depend on the land. We depend on the plants for foods, for ourselves, but also all for our non-human relatives. Plants are not growing at the same time they used to, or they can't be harvested as they used to be harvested. I used to gather wild onions. Raise your hand if you think you used to gather wild onions on the res. And now they're so deep in the ground, they're trying to reach the water table just to get some moisture, that you have to dig pretty deep to even find them. And whatnot. So again, wildfires, you know, are a big impact, but also a lot of our trees are dying, you know, around Flagstaff. I've noticed it because I live here, but also on the res, you know, our pinyon trees are dying. The pinyon nuts aren't as flourishing as they used to be. So it's really amazing what's going on. Amazing in the sense that I can't believe it's going on, right? You know, Jessica is saying that there's unpredictable weather, there's more severe weather and whatnot. So, I mean, when I went to high school here, right? And I remember when it used to snow in May. And we'd be like, and so I hope it snows in May again. I'm ready for warm weather, but we need that warm or that precipitation. Bonnie, I hear you. I hear you, sister, when you say as much as you love gardening, you just don't feel like trying in this relentless drought. Definitely. Logan from Southern California is saying water is much more expensive, and I have caps to how much water he can use. That's insane. Yeah, that's Shyla saying from South Dakota. Their hometown was just threatened by 3 different wildfires. Yeah, it's drastic. It's insane. There's also Jolene, you bring up a really good point, and I'm showing our relative here, the moose, who represents the big game, right? You're talking about the expansion of ticks and mosquitoes and other disease vectors. And Carmelita, you also agree with her on that. That is huge. I went to Prescott Isle, Maine, which is like the most northeastern town in the US, almost near the Canadian border. Actually, I could see the Canadian border, the so-called borders. And I went to a town called Caribou, Maine. Guess what? They haven't seen a caribou in any season for over 10 years. And a lot of the tribes in the Midwest, in the northern woods, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, are really concerned about that because they're moving to warmer or cooler areas, because the ticks and the mosquitoes, chronic wasting disease is really impacting the big game and whatnot. So we have major droughts a few years ago. It was in the news, and it'll be in the news again on the res here, that cattle, livestock were literally dying right in front of our eyes due to no water. And we do have a problem with a lot of feral horses. The one thing too is that sand dune migration is huge because of the less stable soil, because of the plants that aren't growing because there's no water to really sustain them. They're not holding the soil together, and then with these drastic wind weather events, it's real that more and more sand, they're migrating to these areas, and they're actually blocking roadways. That picture right there is in Kayenta. Carmelita, I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but that sand dune is actually blocking a way in and out of that community. But think about grandma and grandpa who live out in a rural area and they only have one way in and one way out. What happens if they need to go to the clinic, which is already 30 miles away or an hour away, and yet they have to deal with that? And what if they get stuck in the sand dune and so on? It's like a domino effect of all this stuff that's happening. Shar says they moved to Prescott in late March of 2019 to find a gorgeous blooming forsythia bush in our yard, and this year they barely had any blooms thanks to the ongoing drought. Yes, we're really seeing what's going on there. And I wanted to give you some examples of what tribes are doing out there. Really quick, I want to read some more of the chat box. BG Ba says, we have the fastest growing sand dune in the nation. Water scarcity that impacts what's already endangered. The black-footed ferret, lack of rainfall, and the constant smoke from the fires are just to name a few of the impacts. In the Tuba City coal mine area, I gather, but also it's happening out here, our neighbors Loop, Tisto, Delcon area, right? I'm pointing over here because I live near the Loop Road. So that's one thing. Jenna is from Washington State. Last year, her family experienced unprecedented wildfires and drought. Yeah, Patrick says reduced water flows, long-term drought, increasing concern with wildfires. See, we're from these different areas, but we're experiencing the same things. I am working with the Quapaw Nation of Oklahoma, which is northeastern Oklahoma. It's really little itty bitty tiny in the northeast Oklahoma, but they are so rich in their culture. They're writing a tribal hazard mitigation plan, or have written one, but they're adding to it. And this is some of the stuff that they're focusing on. And I wanted to show you this list to actually show you what they're experiencing. Drought, earthquakes, expansive soil, subsidence, flooding is huge. They are dealing with so much flooding there, severe weather, constant tornado warnings, and also wildfire. So, and their reservations are not whole like Navajo or Hopi is, like we have here in Arizona. They're actually checkerboarded by trust lands, private lands, their lease lands, and whatnot. It's very complicated. And also the tribe in north central Wisconsin, the Lac du Flambeau tribe, they are focusing their plan on the usual stuff that we are also experiencing, like forest wildfires, hazardous materials, like brownfield sites or Superfund sites where there's waste, like chemical waste, tornadoes, high winds. But also, I thought this was really unique that they mentioned they want in their mitigation plan is the illegal drug crises. There's a huge opioid epidemic up there, and it's impacting their community enough for them to mention in there, but also the school violence and armed attack. I mean, that's crazy that they should be also putting that in their mitigation plan or emergency plan, because all of these hazards, when one of them or all of them happen, it requires emergency services, emergency personnel, communication methods, right? So they're coming up with a plan to address all of that. And I just think it's really sad that they have to mention drug crises and school armed attacks in there. It's heartbreaking. I really also like part of their plan. I've read over 50 of them, and I remember some of them really stand out in these plans. And I mentioned this, how our Indigenous identity is really embedded in the environment. They say the natural resources are cultural resources, and that it's an integral part of what supports the community. So it's like one and the same. They connect with it not only mentally, spiritually. It's not just a job that they do, but it's actually a part of them, and they address that in their plan. I mentioned seawater, sea levels that are rising. The Quinault Nation is going to have to relocate their community to higher ground, and because they're constantly they're really experiencing these flooding events, tsunamis, landslides, wildfire, and droughts, and so on. I mean, they're always in the news as the Quinault Nation, and it's so beautiful out there. But yet they're going to have to move their most vulnerable, infrastructure, meaning like maybe the elder center, elder homes, the school, up to higher ground. Those are what they're making as a part of their priority list. The Aroostook Band of Micmac up in Prescott Isle, Maine, I mentioned, have a very small tribe. They've experienced a lot of hardship due to the mercury levels in their water systems. And so they actually built a tribal fish hatchery to actually feed their people, but also to bring their community back together, because their waters are drying up there too, but also because of the chemicals in the water system, but also access to fresh foods, right? How many of you are lucky enough to go down to the road and buy fresh vegetables whenever you feel like it, even in the middle of the night? I think most of us on this list, we are on this Zoom can, but some of these tribes don't have that privilege, right? If someone can put in the chat box how many grocery stores there are on the Navajo or Hopi, or maybe even Yavapai Apache, just name that. I can go right down here, like literally half a mile, and there's fresh vegetables in this little tiny store. So anyways, they build a fish hatchery to really bring the community back together, and they're growing their own foods, but also economically, they're sending this food to the local restaurants who are buying it, and it's excellent. The Yurok tribe, you've heard about this tribe quite a bit, right? They're a Yurok tribe. They live right near the Klamath Dam, the Klamath River, and they just gave the Klamath River the personhood, rights of personhood. So whoever dares to damage the river is also going to be prosecuted on reservation lands as a human would be prosecuted. It's just like you're abusing the waters and whatnot. So, but yeah, they've experienced fish loss due to warming waters and whatnot. So what they're doing is actually really looking to their elders to revitalize and reinvigorate and really bring it back to the people about their culture, their traditions, and so on. Carmelita, thank you for putting it in there. She said there's approximately 13 grocery stores on the Navajo Nation, which goes into 3 states of the 4 corner states. That's not much. And Karen, you said many people drive more than 30 miles one way to get to one. In Shanto, that's what we do. I drive to Tuba City or Kayenta, or I bring it to my parents. Spokane tribe, they're also dealing with a lot of warming waters. Warm water is bad news for a lot of their salmon species. They can't regenerate, they can't give birth to these fish eggs and whatnot. So yeah, it's a lot of trouble for them. They have an amazing tribal fish hatchery, and they said anyone is welcome when it's safe enough to go back to there, because if you go inside that fish hatchery, it's the most beautiful artwork that tells the story of how salmon came to the Spokane tribe. It's beautiful. And so that's kind of what they're doing, working with the youth, local artists, local citizens. You hear about North Loop family farms. Again, 13 grocery stores on the res. Some of us don't have rides always to get to where we need to. Beaver farms, there's Chiji farms, so many that are out there growing foods and whatnot to give people access. Chiji Farms is also by Tyrone Thompson, is building hoop houses everywhere. So that's one thing he's trying to do to help bring fresh foods to the community. This is just a really nice, simple graphic. I want you to take a good look at that, because it says the caribou's life is not easy at first, right? When they had just to worry about the usual stuff, the usual diseases, snow levels, and whatnot. And with the onset of colonialism, the settlers, the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden they had to worry about 10 times the amount of worry. And then now you introduce climate change coming at a faster rate. And then now it's like, where did the caribou grow? You know, it's a really good example of what, or a visual of what's going on. And this is from the Caribou Management Board that are amazing. I'm going to close out with this because I'd give time to Karen. I'm sorry if I'm going over a little bit. I think I said it would take 10 minutes. I think I'm going over that a little bit, but us Navajos, you get us talking, you can't shut us up sometimes, right? I see a lot of nodding heads. So climate change is really impacting the Indigenous ways of life, our language, and our practices. Because if we don't have corn, if we don't have this, if we don't have the materials needed for our subsistence ways of life, then we can't gather, then we can't come together and continue those intergenerational sharings and whatnot. And remember, I want you all to acknowledge our non-human relatives, because without our non-human relatives, we wouldn't be where we're at. Plants, water, and so on. Spider Woman is the one that saved the Navajo people from freezing and not eating and whatnot. So we pay homage to them. And so there's a lot of tribe adaptation plans out there if you want to read it. Raina put a lot of good lists, links in there, and I encourage you to read it. People are doing some really amazing stuff, because these documents are proof that in the Western way of doing things, that we are doing something about it, and we seek out funding this way. So a lot of good resources out there. I encourage you to look. But with that, I want to give time to Karen. So I hope if you have questions, please let me know. But thank you for listening, and appreciate all of you very much. I muted myself.
Wow, thanks, Nikki. That was amazing. Raina, did you want me to jump right in, or did you have another?
Yep, no, you can totally just jump right in.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start off by, since I'm not physically there right now, but I'm with Northern Arizona University, so I'd like to start off by acknowledging that Northern Arizona University sits at the base of the San Francisco Peaks. in Flagstaff and sits on the traditional homelands of many indigenous nations, including the Navajo and Hopi peoples, and many other nations in it. We have 22 indigenous nations in Arizona alone. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Raina for inviting me this evening, and Nikki, my co-panelist. She rocks, doesn't she? She's pretty amazing. I could listen to you go on and on. So I will also introduce myself. I don't know if I have any Choctaw relatives here this evening, but I would just like to say, Aito, Sahitjofo Karen Jarratt-Snider, Ishkitek, June Kalstein, June Camp, Jarratt, Ishkitek Kenneth Eldon Jarratt, Mafo Lois Manon Jarratt, Sipukniat Alvi Jarratt, Sipukniat Jefferson Davis Jarratt, Amafoat B Jarratt. Those are my parents and my grandparents, and so this is the way that we introduce ourselves. So again, thank you all for being here, and I'll jump right in. COVID, it's been a tough almost 2 years now, well, year and a half. And COVID has affected all of us worldwide. It's touched everyone's lives. And more than just the minor inconvenience of not being able to go out to eat or not being able to visit family and friends or to gather together in social gatherings like we have. I haven't run across anyone in quite some time who hasn't lost someone or had a family member or a friend fall gravely ill. So it certainly has affected the entire world community. But for Indigenous peoples, I would say we were particularly hard hit. And some of you may have seen the news, was in the news briefly, that the Navajo Nation's COVID rate at one point exceeded, their COVID case rate exceeded the per cap rate of New York, the city of New York. And that was surprising to a lot of people, right? What was not in the news was that the White Mountain Apache tribe here in eastern Arizona, at one point, their rate exceeded that of the Navajo Nation. So when we look at it on a per capita basis, right, it was very devastating. And some folks really didn't understand why that was. And because there wasn't a great deal of understanding, we began to see cases of racial hatred, targeting particularly Navajo people. But when the news got out about the high rate of COVID cases on the Navajo Nation, and I don't know if anyone may have heard this or not. I'm going to try and keep up with the chat here. So bear with me, I'm not good at splitting my focus here. We had, there was a gentleman who lives in Page, Arizona, who was writing on social media, Navajos are 100% infected, kill them wherever you see them. He was arrested, right? But there were many more incidents like that that weren't reported in the news, such as one of our students in my department reported a friend who was sprayed with Lysol while she was trying to get gas at a gas station in New Mexico. So now we're hearing about backlash against Asian peoples over COVID, but it's not widely known that this also has happened to Indigenous peoples here in the US. So why the high infection rates? Well, there are a number of reasons for that. And one is that and I don't want to generalize and stereotype here, but this is true of many Indigenous nations and communities. Family is everything, right? And when we say family, we mean extended family. And so oftentimes you'll have more than one generation living in the same household and people coming to visit all of the time. And so there's more opportunity, right, for COVID to spread. And then in rural reservations and nations such as the Navajo Nation for one, but others, where there's not running water in every community or every household, people are having to haul in water. So they have to haul in water, and then they have to decide, are we going to use it for our animals, our sheep, our cattle, our horses that need water, or are we going to use it to increase hand washing, these kinds of things? So lack of access to the same sorts of services, essential services that many of us take for granted on an everyday basis, is something that is not that uncommon, and particularly in rural reservations. And that in itself is an environmental justice issue, but that's a broader topic. So we'll come back to that later. So things like access to running water, and then the efforts that the tribal leaders and government officials instituted to try and keep the infection rates down and try and keep their communities safe, such as lockdown measures. Did anyone hear about the lockdown measures? The ones on the Navajo Nation were more widely publicized, perhaps, but San Carlos Apache tribe had lockdown measures. Zuni had lockdown measures. In fact, my husband and I had gone to Colorado. We went on a fishing trip because, going out to the woods, that's one of the safe activities you could do during a pandemic. We came back through and we were stopped at the border because there's a state highway that runs right through Zuni's nation. We're stopped at the border and we explained to the officer we were just going straight through. And she said, that's fine. You have to stay on the highway. You can't get off to get gas. You can't get off to get ice, get groceries. And I'm going to tell the officer at the other end that you're coming through, and we're going to time you to make sure that you're going straight through, right? And those measures were necessary, absolutely necessary. But the toll that they took on communities was enormous. We're talking about economic impacts of COVID on Native nations. For example, here in Arizona, and especially in northern Arizona, tourism is a huge economic driver for Native nations. So there was no tourism because of lockdown orders, no casinos, and not all of our Native nations across the US and in Arizona have casinos, but for those that do, that's an economic driver, and those were shut down, as well as tourism, and then recreation. So for example, the White Mountain Apache tribe and the San Carlos Apache tribe are very popular places in Arizona to go hiking, to go fishing, to go hunting. All of that was shut down, right? So the economic impacts are not yet widely understood. We know they're tremendous. We just don't know what the total figures are going to be. And then that has a domino effect, right? Because we bring people in who buy recreation permits. That's one source of revenue. But they're also then buying gas, they're buying groceries, they're staying in hotels, they're buying camping equipment, and that in turn creates secondary jobs. So the economic impact is going to be tremendous, but we won't be able to assess that really until the pandemic is over or nearly over. Then there are the cultural and social impacts. So, for example, ceremonies, particularly seasonal ceremonies, right? Celebrating, well, in certain parts of the country, for certain nations, they celebrate the strawberries coming out, their strawberry ceremonies. And there are so many others, but people can't gather together to do those. They can't gather together to say goodbye and properly and do the type of cultural practices that are common and necessary when a loved one passes. So social institutions have been disrupted, cultural institutions were disrupted. And as devastating as this sounds, and it was and remains devastating, the good news is that in so many instances, we found Indigenous peoples and nations to be resilient. So for example, San Carlos Apache had this lockdown order. They have a state highway running through like Zuni did, and you could go through, but if you were on the reservation without explicit permission and for an approved purpose, you could be fined $1,000 by the tribe. That's very serious, right? So the lockdown was taken seriously, and San Carlos Apache had a handful of cases compared to other people, right? Their institutions worked and they kept their people safe. Others we are finding are leaning on all sorts of community assets. And that could be something like, for example, with the White Mountain Apache tribe, it was reported that their community health representatives were the key in bringing their infection rates down. They brought them down to the point where they've been able to reopen the reservation now. People are again able to go out and take part in recreation and other enterprises, excuse me, of the tribe. But it was the community health representatives who were key in doing that. Why? Because they can speak the language in some cases, but in all cases, they know the community. They would go around and do daily wellness checks, make sure that doctors were in touch with potential patients. They were absolutely key in terms of contact tracing, right? Which we all know by now is an important avenue to bringing down the caseload, to identifying people who are infected early on and getting them the treatment they need. So those types of community assets, the elders in communities have been so critical in establishing and nurturing the resilience of Indigenous nations and peoples, in terms of leaning on them for moral support or being able to come out and provide the healing that has to take place with a family when someone passes or someone has been ill. It's just, I can't state that enough. And so many other ways that people have leaned on their community assets. Schools, teachers are an important community asset we've been finding. And I could go on and on. It's hard to know actually where to stop here, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I don't know, I can't promise that I'll have answers, but for your questions at least, I would just say that in closing, Indigenous peoples have faced desperately difficult circumstances in our histories, including settler colonialism. And yet we've always managed to be resilient. And in the case of COVID, we're proving once again that we are still able to be resilient. So much hardship has occurred, but when you see a community have a success story and another community being able to build on that, that's something to hold on to. And so I would really like to leave you on that hopeful note after discussing such a dark topic. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you both seriously so much for sharing your knowledge and experiences. I know I personally learned a lot, and I know others did as well. And we really appreciate all the work that you guys have been doing and have done. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so now we're going to go ahead and open it up for the Q&A session. And I think someone raised their hand. I'm sorry, I can't see it. I have a lot of tabs open right now. but I think you can go ahead and unmute yourself for the person who has their hand raised. I think that you can do that.
Yes. Hi, sorry, and I apologize. I have 3 little ones who are running around in the back, making lots of noise. I love these presentations. Thank you both so much. I started to tear up, because I live in these communities and it's been devastating and it's been hard. And to have somebody speak truth to that, it's very empowering and liberating. There was a piece that, in talking about Settler colonialism, something for our community, that we're becoming more and more aware of the impact of is, the livestock reduction and putting a cap on our ability to communally herd, right? And the role that livestock plays in replenishing the soil. And in the food insecurity, right? So we had our traditional orchards intentionally cut down. And you see that on either coast. My mother is Tuscarora from New York, and there was the Sullivan campaign where these massive, tracts of land were managed, and you see cornfields just burned down everywhere, and that being a tactic, right? We know that that's illegal now, but the impacts of that are still felt. And so when we talk about food insecurity, when we talk about having these 13 grocery stores, on the Navajo Nation, what that meant when COVID hit was, everybody went to town and bulk bought the shelves. And for Native people, who are living in rural areas, like my own community, we depend on bulk buying. Everybody goes to town maybe, once a week at most. And so when everything was ripped off of the shelves, going into town and not being able to find food was horrible, and it's terrifying and scary. And then trying to find ways to feed each other without our traditional food sources being in place. We really did have to come together and find ways and find resources and look to outsiders to bring us food. And how we address this climate change and really taking into consideration Indigenous lifeways and the relationship that is there and the way it empowers the environment and feeds it, I think, was something that it's vital. And I'm just, again, so glad that you guys are having this conversation. So yeah.
Thank you for that. That's such a hard one. I couldn't trust myself to talk about that without being emotional, because it was very scary, and hearing these stories from our students and that was another impact. The students, our college students, our students at all levels were struggling to get an education in areas where the digital divide is very real and didn't have internet, and are having to find somebody who has a ride, who can take them to one of the Wi-Fi spots just so they can sit in their car and go to school and do it without possibly even having had breakfast or knowing if they're going to have dinner. It takes a toll on one's mental well-being, right? Our spirit and our well-being, but we're going to get through it. We have gotten through it, right?
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing that. Yeah, does anyone else have anything they would like to add or ask our speakers or whoever? You can go ahead and put it in the chat or either unmute yourselves.
This is Nikki. I think I'd like to say that these gatherings are really important, whether they're by Zoom, Facebook Live, or any tool, but even in person, is that we need to be supportive of each other and share these stories, because we're not that unique. What makes reservations or Indigenous communities unique in how they experience climate change and the pandemic is that we don't have access to resources like we do here in town. Some people don't have the vehicles to haul water, you know, to fill their water barrels at home and also at the livestock corrals. The difference is that my grandmother hurts herself, and then her phone may or may not get the signal to call emergency services or even call my parents who live a mile down the road for assistance. You know, knowing her, she's probably going to drive herself anyway. And then like she's 90 something and she's still driving around. And so there's a lot that makes these impacts more unique than those of us that are in urban areas, or those of us who have the means to respond. Like I'm an introvert. This pandemic didn't hurt me socially whatsoever. Okay, I don't mind staying at home. I grew up on the res, in the middle of the res, no lights, no running water. I'm good. You know, my kids were fine. My husband's fine. He's from Iowa and whatnot. But it was really watching my elders that I did not know, but I also knew that I was related to them somehow, passing on it was unnecessary. Their deaths, they could have been prevented with a lot of these actions we could have taken. So I just want you guys to all think about that when you're thinking about these communities that are on the reservations, but also in these low income marginalized communities. Gone. That's normal for me, you know. And then when you live in the cities and you're expecting people to isolate, you know, and then that's asking a lot for us who go out and work in different areas. So just think about that when you are thinking about these topics. So with that, I would love to hear a question or another comment from someone in the Zoom room. Thank you.
This has been such a gift to, I went to the session this afternoon on Indigenous people. I am learning so much, such an appreciation, things I never knew. So after hearing you and the preceding lady, I think her name was Karen, and even this afternoon, it gives you such appreciation for what we take for granted. So it's eye-opening, and, you know, appreciate all that you have shared with us and the horrible hardships that you much more endured than we did. So we have to do better for all of us. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. I totally agree. These are definitely important conversations that we need to start having more and having people get more educated about. Right. Yep. Sorry, I see Jim.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just like to share that, like the last speaker just talked about, you know, from today's sessions, you know, kind of one of the epiphanies for me that I've known for a long time, but it became so relevant, is the resiliency aspect that Native Americans have, because they have adapted through, you know, so many effects of change. And I think it's some of the oldest knowledge that mankind or peoplekind has is Indigenous people. And we all need to share. And I know that there's some things that are inappropriate for them to share with us because it just is not right. It's sacred. But I do think the boldness and the willingness to share their science are part of the climate solutions that we need, because their adaptation to where they've lived since time began, which is, you know, who knows, 40,000 years, a long, long time. is more knowledge than we have in the Library of Congress. So I really so value their knowledge and their willing to share us, because I think they are definitely part of the solutions and part of the strength of resiliency and problem solving, because their connections are so strong. They've seen what it takes to adapt. And I think with our dishwashers and our dryers and our stoves on this luxurious, convenient life we have, we just get a mechanic to fix it or blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? But we haven't really nurtured resiliency skills except with the use of our money. So living with the land is, anyway, I'll stop. But it is so important that we learn those when it comes to gardening. It comes to connecting with the spirit and, with our relatives and their, it's very, anyway, I thank you all very much.
Thank you for that, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I see Carmelita has her hand up. You can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thank you. Hopefully it's not too windy. I'm actually out on a hike right now, but I just want to thank Shada, Nikki, and also Karen for great presentations. And I guess I have an observation and then a question. So my observation, I always find it very interesting that when it comes to these types of conversations about Indigenous futures, Indigenous knowledge, and pairing those two together to find culturally relevant and sustainable solutions to, I guess, ascertain or to secure healthy futures for all of us. There's always there's an unequal gender ratio in the audience. So it's predominantly women who always attend these presentations. And so that's my observation. My question is to the two presenters, and maybe even to those in the audience, is how do we include the men's participation in these crucial discussions? And what are some of the factors that play into the unequal ratio that we see when these conversations arise?
Go ahead, Nikki. Your camera's not on, so I can't tell when you're ready to chime in.
Okay, sure. That's a really good question, Shadeja. So how I think there's a reason why in Indigenous societies that we have roles for men and women, and they're all designed to support one another and not to be exclusive, except for they have their certain roles. For example, the Hopi women as I learned, they're not allowed to go down the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River for many reasons, and only men can. So there's a reason for that. But I think in saying that, we have to carve out and assign these roles to men, but also not just leadership. That's like Western way of thinking. And I mean that Western way from the King of England and the King of Spain all the way down here, and then now in our societies, we're supposed to have men and women leadership, but yet the men, now it's designed to where men are sitting at the top, and the role of women is in the kitchen, and that's not right. So we have to really be verbal, like we're doing right now, Shadeja, like you mentioned, where we have to say men and women have to work together and we have to design those roles. I don't know what that looks like, but I do agree with you. In a lot of the workshops that I do, they're mostly women. And I asked why one time, and they said, oh, my boss is a man and he sent me here. He doesn't think it's worth his time to come, and he just wants me to come and report back to him. No, you demand that he come. Leadership needs to demand that everybody, there's an equity in the learning and not just reporting to. and whatnot. So, I mean, I think that would be my answer for now. There's so much more into this. But men, I want to end with, men have to be comfortable with women too, in having us in that role where we are at the top, or at the leadership role, and you have to be okay with it. And that is why I married my husband. Because he is okay with that. He does not care. That does not minimize who he is, though. In fact, it elevates who he is, and now he's my mother's favorite. I don't know if Karen has something to add, but yeah, that's what I would say for that for now.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on, Nikki. And I would also add that, you know, in Indigenous environmental justice work, we see disproportionately that women are leaders in that area. And in that regard, it's not that surprising because we have Indigenous environmental justice areas in schools, in the workplace, in our sacred cultural areas, right? And so women are just in the middle of all of that, right? We're raising the kids, we're teachers, and we're problem solving, I guess is what I want to say, and multitasking, problem solving and multitasking. And so it's not uncommon when we talk about IEJ issues like climate change to see women being more involved. But I agree with Nikki, that has to change. And so I would say, good for you, Nikki, that you found a husband who's right there with you every step of the way. And we just have to keep working to get men more involved in these kinds of endeavors.
I just want to pop in. Thank you for bringing this up. I can talk about this topic all night, but it's so important. And I think we see that a lot of the solutions to climate change that men bring up are solar panels and electric vehicles, which are all important, but a lot of marginalized communities can't afford these luxuries. And we need to find women to bring their creativity and knowledge to bring us back to nature and the land and stuff. So I just wanted to add that, and thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And I think Pat has a question. You can go ahead, Pat, and unmute yourself.
I just wanted to also mention with great respect the Navajo Hopi COVID relief volunteers. Many of you are probably aware of what they've been doing in Navajo Nation and the Hopi villages, and they've been doing it month after month after month during this pandemic. I just want to give them a shout out.
Thanks, Pat. They're doing amazing work, and it's good to see you.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning them, Pat. That was also that relief effort is also primarily run by women, and with the support of many strong men, native and non-native too. So that's really important. So thank you.
I have another question if nobody else is. So you went over the strategic plan for Mother Nations, and I keep looking to Navajo to come up, or I don't know if there is one, you know, for us. I was talking to, because I sit on the Community Land Use Planning Committee, and we're trying to come up with a regional plan. And I had been reaching out to people with, you know, background in permaculture to really talk about, like, how do we grow our own resources in this area? And I had talked to Tony Robbins with the BIA, and they were coming up with a regional plan, but there wasn't a lot of community engagement. So I don't really know, you know, what is out there? What is the plan? How are we going to address these things? Because, you know, there's this weight that's put on us as individuals, and we're talking about land that interacts in so many different ways. So when we're coming up with these plans, what resources are available for us to reach out and really have an idea with, you know, people who work in climate to assess what the best approach is.
Yes, thank you, Bijiba. That's a really good question, and I should have brought that up. I don't know why I didn't. But yet, the Navajo Nation, they do have a climate adaptation plan that was created by or headed up by the Fish and Wildlife Department. You all know very well that there's a very complicated relationship between the communities themselves and the government departments. And whatnot. So ITEP did have a role in that. Like I helped them with their very first workshop where they had all the division leadership, department leaderships, I think, yeah, department leaderships come, and some of their staff members come to Flagstaff, and it was like pulling teeth. They have stuff to do. One of them didn't believe in climate change. One didn't care. But overall, I would say like about 98% were really interested in how climate change was affecting them, especially those who worked in mining and reclamation, or maybe even the Navajo Rangers, which there's too few of. And it's interesting that you say that. I don't know why this plan is not more supported or disseminated out in the communities. I did a workshop down in Las Cruces with the Southwest Climate Hub, who they do a lot of focus on agriculture, livestock, and whatnot. They're a really good organization that helps people. But there was a woman who came from, I think, Crown Point, and she was like, I did not know Navajo Nation. She was really mad. She was like the land use planner too. She's like, I don't understand why the Navajo Nation didn't tell us. She's like, I've been looking and I've been asking and I haven't gotten anything. And I said, there's opportunities for communities because you are your own governance. You have your own governance. You have your own, leadership there that can even apply for funding to write a plan, your land use plan. You can include climate change language into it. That could make it a little bit stronger to get more funding, or maybe even more traction to get partnership support in some way. That's me talking. Doing is really hard. I can help you that way, and I keep in touch with her, and she's kind of at her wit's end on some days because she's one person, And she's like, my leadership doesn't always believe in climate change, or they don't want to talk about it. They have other stuff to worry about. And that's very true for a lot of communities, right? Not non-native communities. But I think this should be like a primary, we're top on the priority list. So Bijiba, I hope that really does help. And I'll try and put in the plan in the box. It's hard to find on the Fish and Wildlife Department too. Seriously, I don't know why it's kind of like hidden in there. So I have like a quick dial to that, to the plan itself. And I think I put it in there. It's a PDF document. I can send it to you if you give me your email address too. But I want to end with the saying that what you said about there was not a lot of community engagement. It's very true. And also Indigenous traditional knowledge was not a big component of it, which is what a lot of the staff did actually say. And so hopefully they'll go through another reiteration. I hope they get funding to do that. So I think they were just trying to write something to get something out there while leadership would support it. Before President Jonathan Nez, I really believe that the council would not support it, but they actually passed a resolution in 2018 to finally do that. And that's a big step. That's huge. And I will celebrate that. So, but with that, yeah, I hope I answered your question. Oh, good. And Jenna says she'll email this out to everyone in a follow-up email. So yeah. If there's a climate plan that you're curious about, I will probably know about it, especially if it's on tribal lands. I've pretty much read all of them. I'm still reading them over and over again. So I just want to mention that Carmelita said she didn't mean to allude to only strict gender binary with her observation and question. We do recognize all genders and whatnot. So thank you for mentioning that. Back to you, Rain.
Awesome, thank you. If anyone else has any other questions they want to ask? All right, I'm not seeing anyone unless I'm missing. All right. Well, I think that's it. I guess we'll just wrap up now. So thank you again for all of us for joining us, and thank you especially to our speakers, Nikki and Dr. Karen. We really appreciate it. I know I learned a ton, and I know everybody else did too. Just one last quick thing, I'll let you go. NASCA has more events coming up for Earth Week. And so, yeah, I think Jenna's going to put them in the chat for the link to all those events. But yeah, we really appreciate your time and engagement. And yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, hug on that.